Good evening and welcome to everyone that's come to this meeting. I think the whole of England is reeling with the riots that have occurred all over England supposedly in response to the dreadful murders, awful murders of three little girls that happened last week, from which we've all been reeling and shocked at what's happened. And since then, we've had these dreadful riots happening all over England, all over in various towns. And so this meeting is all about what answer has the left got to this absolute deluge of far right riots that we're seeing in our cities? What answers have we got, immediate and long term? So I'm going to start off the meeting by going over to Steve Freeman to give an introduction from our Republican point of view. But I'm rather hoping that some of you will have been to some anti-fascist demos and can give us reports, or perhaps community work, community action that's gone on at your local mosque or whatever, and you could report back to us, to the group, about how that is going and how that is helping. So first of all, let's go to Steve Freeman.
Thank you, Carol and comrades. I will try. I have so much to say about this that I'm almost felt like I got lost in it. So I'm really going to try to cut it down, and I'm very interested to hear what comrades have got to say. So I'll try to be brief. I know that's easier said than done. I did want to say, that I always remember the old phrase, "England united will never be defeated." So obviously, last night, these riots, these fascist riots, took place basically in England. There've been none in Wales and none in Scotland. Now that doesn't say it couldn't happen there, by the way, as if somehow they're immune from it. They're not. And also there weren't any in London, and nothing had happened in London either, significantly, I think, as well. And but in Belfast, we know there was something else going on in Belfast. So really, this is a situation made in England, and it's very much about England. And so, in some ways, last night we could say, I think the people in England won a great victory, and it's a kind of victory against fascism. And obviously, when I say won a victory, not everybody, but I think the numbers were, as I've seen somewhere, something like 250,000 people. Oh, no, not 250,000, 25,000 people is reported in the Guardian or in the Independent, came out on the streets in various places. I mean, quite widely. Walthamstow, Finchley, Birmingham, Bristol, Newcastle, Blackpool, Durham, Northampton, Sheffield, Brighton, Norwich, Manchester, John, possibly Cheadle. I don't know if it was Manchester or Cheadle. I'm sure there are more things happening that comrades might report about. Basically, workers, students, young people, trade unionists, Muslims, Christians, Jews, from various political parties, social movements, from different classes, etc., all came out to occupy those spaces and protect the either lawyers' offices or asylum seekers' offices, etc., to defend them. And of course, it's a victory because the fascists basically didn't turn up for whatever reason. Of course, it wasn't a victory won alone. It was a victory. But on one hand, we had the police and the Crown that were acting quite strongly to suppress those riots, arrest people and put them before court. So they were doing that. But it was the people coming out, I think it was really, really important to show that, especially for Muslims and ethnic minorities, I think there's a hell of a lot of people out there acting in solidarity with them. So I think it's very, very important. And I thought of two things I saw today. I don't know if you saw this. One was I saw that, and I want to contrast those. This guy called William Nelson Morgan, who was convicted of violent disorder in Southport, and he was punished with an exemplary sentence at Liverpool Crown Court. You might have heard it on the radio today. Morgan is a retired welder, aged 69, and he was carrying a piece of wood for self-protection, he claimed, and he was jailed for 32 months. and he was with a group of people who apparently had attacked a library and a food bank. I mean, if you can imagine that. Why are you here? Apparently, the policeman said, as they were struggling to control him. And of course, he said in response, I am English, leave me alone. And it was reported he looked a broken man in the dock, and his lawyer said he was deeply remorseful and he didn't have a record of violence before. So that's in some ways a tragedy, as well as something else you might say about it. But I wanted to contrast that with something else that happened yesterday. A young English woman was being represented in the Supreme Court. And of course, her name was Shamima Begum, an English Muslim deprived of her citizenship in 2019 by the Home Secretary Shahid Javid. She's had no trial, not been convicted of any crime. But in March, the Supreme Court rejected her bid to challenge the removal of her citizenship. And the judges dismissed her case. So she also is facing a severe punishment. And I actually think that if she'd been a white person, a white English person, she would not have been treated in the same way. So I think here we have the idea that an ethnic minority person, a Muslim person, is not really English. So, and it should also remind us that people in England and the rest of the UK don't have our fundamental rights protected or embedded in the constitution. Ministers of the Crown can remove our citizenship and the courts will uphold their decisions. And I think that's an interesting contrast if you think about two versions of what it is to be England. I want to conclude this little bit of my introduction simply by asking the question, well, who are the English people? What kind of people are they? Does an English nation exist? And can we find all the clues? I think we can find all the clues and contradictions in these fascist rights and in the opposition to them. It was a victory, I would say, yesterday, but not a solution, because there's quite a big difference between one and the other. Because a solution is just like chopping the head off weeds. It doesn't dig them out of the ground. You know, if you just simply chop the weeds away and you haven't dug them up. So I think there's a much deeper problem to be addressed. If these riots, we don't know if this is the end of the riots or whether they were going to come back. There's going to be some more talk about things going on today. Have they now been suppressed? Are they now defeated? We're not totally sure of that. We will see. But I think there is a problem here in England, an English question, an English problem, which is about identity, and it's about democracy, and it's about our governance and who are the English. And these matters are matters that need to be addressed, and ones which the left tends to ignore. Now, in the general election, we produced a leaflet, and we were talking in this leaflet as well as a manifesto. So I think for us, it's a question of does the manifesto is called the Manifesto for a Commonwealth of England. It's attempting to address the question of democracy in England and identity in England, the English question. If we look to if we look to the Scottish papers, which I was looking at later on, let me just turn to my notes on that. The Scottish paper called The National complains about the national press talking about Tinderbox Britain and riots engulfed Britain. And one of the commentators says, there's a problem. We see a problem here. Britain is an island of free countries. I do not see any riots in Wales and Scotland. This crisis of social identity in England. And of course, the English Defence League doesn't exist as an organisation. And of course, but it's become the brand around which the fascist organisations like Britain First have rallied their forces, because it's a brand name that's kind of well known, but it doesn't go down well. It doesn't go down well as an identity in Wales or Scotland. Bella Caledonia argues that although Scotland is not immune to racism and bigotry, these riots are a particularly English phenomenon of ethno-nationalism, and this concerns the inability, he says, the editor of Bella Caledonia, to give voice to English identity, and it's paradoxically one of the drivers of this crisis. Many commentators have noted that England is frequently subsumed within Britain and Britishness, and he argues that's a completely false way. There's an English problem, an English question, and these riots show that indeed that is true, and it's one that hasn't been addressed, hasn't been solved. Now, Nigel Farage gave an interview to the New Statesman, and in this interview he says this, and I think it's it's something that he says during the general election. Interviewed by New Statesman, he says something is going on, and he blamed societal decline, and he said he considered there's a bleak mood. Now, there's something going on. He didn't mean if something's going on, obviously something's going on, but what he meant by something extraordinary is going on. Something different, something distinct is happening. And we've tried to analyze what that distinct thing that's happening is. A crisis of our democracy, is a failure of our social and political order, and a loss of trust in politics. I mean, it's interesting that Parliament hasn't been called, has played no role in this crisis at all, hasn't been convened. So really, there's the people of England, and then there's the Crown, the police, the government, but Parliament has had no role in this situation at all. Now, in the election leaflet that we put over, we talked about there being two Englands. We said there's a democratic England, and we spoke about the hundreds of thousands of people in England that have come out onto the streets against British support for Israel. And we said democratic England is that part of England that stands in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their struggle for freedom and self-determination. And we contrasted that with the idea of a reactionary England, which was British in its ideology, that flew the Union Jacks, the flags of St. George, and indeed Israeli flags that we all saw, and supported massacres and ethnic cleansing and genocide in Palestine. Are those two Englands that appeared in the general election, that appeared in the support that grew for Reform Party, and it also was expressed in the support for the independent candidates. I believe those same two things have now been confronting each other in these riots, both in the riots and in what happened last night. I think the people that came out on the streets last night were the same party, if you like, that came out in support of Palestine. And indeed, if you look at the demonstrations, you see Palestinian flags there. So there is happening, unfolding, a crisis of democracy, a polarization taking place between a reactionary and fascist version of England, which the guy that was sent down today was talking about in Liverpool, and a progressive democratic England that came out massively on the streets. Now, what we were talking about in our manifesto is the need to politicize that, in a sense, and have a program for that democratic England to take that process further forward. And that means, of course, that we have to look back into our history, because we have to go back into history to find out the source of racism, the source of Islamophobia, the failure of our democracy, and all of those things that appear to have come to a head through this particular crisis. This fascist uprising, as I would call it, right? It's been defeated by a combination of the police, the Crown, Keir Starmer on one hand, suppressing it, and the courts. But on the other hand, by this other independent part, this what I call democratic England coming out on the streets to defend the idea of a different kind of England and to say another England is possible. So I think that I'm going to stop at this point, comrades. So I'm very interested to hear how you want to, what you've got to report and what you've got to say on that. And I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Steve. A nice brief introduction. Good. And raised a number of points which I think people will need to discuss. I've got Ken hand up and I've got Mike Hope's hand up. So I'm going to bring Ken in first.
Yes, I mean, Steve, you persist in calling these groups fascist, and in my view, that suggests a coherent program and ideology behind them, which, frankly, I see no evidence of. And I think in calling them fascist, you almost dignify them with a political position they probably or almost definitely could not articulate themselves. So I think it's a little bit lazy to just label them as fascist when there's no discernible ideology behind them apart from a dislike of anybody they perceive as not being what they view as English. And on the point of, what you describe as one England, which comes out in support of Palestine, I put it to you that many of the people on those demonstrations taking place in the geography of England were probably Irish, Welsh, Scottish. And again, I think it is dangerous to keep attaching yourself to the words English and England. And this is a discussion we've had before, and I'm not expecting to convert you in this meeting. I'd have been much happier if you'd chosen something like another Britain rather than another England, because the inhabitants of this island are a deeply mongrel people with all sorts of races and ancestry. And I think anything which attempts to extract any particular nationality or group is deeply flawed and actually dangerous in terms of its tendency to excite nationalism, the worst type of which we've seen in these riots. I was never a supporter of the Scottish National Party, and that's one reason I haven't formally joined the English National Party either. I just think it's a mistake to focus on a particular group within these islands. And I think we should focus more on the class issues which are causing these conflicts, which I think are a more profound cause than any perceived or imaginary ethnic background to them. So, like I said, I don't expect to convert you now, but I'd just like you at least to consider those points. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. I'm going to bring Mike. Mike's got his hand up, and John and Peter. So, Mike.
Yeah, apologies. I need to get this in early because I have to leave in about half an hour. First of all, Ken, on what you said, as it happens, I mean, yeah, people may or may not be of these origins. For instance, Mr. 69-year-old William John, whatever he was, Morgan, is pretty plainly of Welsh extraction, as are many people living in Liverpool. But the point is, he identified very clearly and vociferously with the Copts as being English. And I think we need to make the point that it is English nationalism which is pernicious. And I think you completely misunderstand the situation if you think that Scottish nationalism, Scotland isn't an oppressed country as such, but it very much a junior partner in England's endeavours as it created Great Britain and then the United Kingdom and conquered swathes of empire. Scotland, always a junior partner, always told what to do, brought into line if they didn't. And to equate the two nationalisms is, I think, quite wrong. Ditto in Wales, certainly ditto in Ireland, which I notice you didn't mention, which is a divided country partitioned by British imperialism and likely to be reunited quite soon. However, anyway, that isn't what I wanted to say. Just on what Steve said, be aware, and as you probably asked, Steve, that the media version of this, the BBC media version of this afternoon, is that the fascists were driven away entirely by the police. There is no mention of the vast demonstrations out against them. Equally, neither is there by the Labour Party. And there's one report that the Finchley MP, who's now a new Labour MP, was very distressed to see the anti-fascists out. She is a Jewish MP. So he was nonetheless very distressed to see the anti-fascists out and called the police. That's what the Labour Party think about anti-fascist demonstrators. And no doubt they completely, well, there was a guy on Radio 4, a junior minister for something or another, communities and whatever, saying that he you know, the Labour Party members are being instructed not to join demonstrations. This goes further though. Stop the racist. Stop the racist. Oh, what's it called? The sort of semi-SWP front. Stop the racism.
Say no. Say no to racism.
Say no to racism. Thank you, Carol. There is footage from, I'm not quite sure where last night, of one of their Jobsworth trying to shut down a woman, an Asian woman who was speaking, who raised the question of Palestine. They tried very hard to turn her off. And it was only because of intervention of the crowd that they desisted. They clearly don't like it. And that's a real weakness of their campaign. So we need to be aware, you know, that there are limitations to some of the political leadership of this, even on the left. And then behind all of this, of course, are the international players. You know, Musk seems to be, you know, the richest man in the world, paying a hell of a lot of attention to this and taking a delight in winding up Keir Starmer. Well, we might agree on that, but little else. Steve Bannon is undoubtedly doing his thing. He has deep-reaching connections, the European far right. And Russell, you're going to love this. Yes, Putin and his mates, they're at it too. And no doubt you'll call that hogwash, but, you know, and you, as you rubbish the reporters who say that it is hogwash, but nonetheless, there's plenty of evidence. I don't know how far you want to suppress the evidence. Very finally, just a report I've just seen from somebody who was at the far smaller demo last night at Aldershot. You know, army barracks and all that. It's quite a strong anti-fascist presence. 60 anti-fascists, about 10 or 15 fascists, and the cops. And, you know, a very strong feeling that the fascists were driven away because of that presence. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Mike. Steve, do you want to come back in now, or shall we?
Only just agree with Mike. There were two parts to this thing, and Mike's absolutely right that the Crown part of this exercise don't wish to recognise the popular part of this exercise. They didn't mention it anywhere, and in fact, they wanted people. They thought that people should stay at home and not go out on the streets. That make it more difficult for the police. So that was their angle in it, as Mike suggested. So we're obviously playing up the people's part in all this, because it's that makes a complete difference to how people feel about their communities. It's one thing for the cops to come, but it's something else when thousands of local people come out on the streets to protect, you know, to defend you. And that makes a completely different impact on those people, ethnic minorities, that feel really threatened. They feel even if they go out their houses, they might be attacked by some person in the streets. I mean, listening to the stories before yesterday is really quite shocking and terrible. That just ordinary people of ethnic minority backgrounds were scared to go out their houses. So the mere that is the big factor. It's the presence of people on the streets that's the big thing. And as Mike said, the Labour Party probably said stay at home. The government probably wanted you to stay at home, and it was all down to the police suppressing the fascists. Leave it all up to us, they said. But fortunately, people didn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the question that Ken raised, I kind of Mike sort of answered that. So maybe I'll come back at that one later, because obviously that's a big difference. It is all about who is English, and it's interesting to see how Ken views that. But anyway, let's have other comments.
Right, I'm going to bring in John now.
Thanks, Carol. First of all, on what's just been said, I agree with Ken over the use of the expression fascist. And I spoke at the Cheadle meeting last night to that effect, because I think it is extremely important that we differentiate, at least in terms of the street fighters of the riots, between fascism and who they are and what they are. There may be fascists amongst them, and probably are, egging them on, providing tactical leadership, etc., pointing them towards targets and so on. But this is entirely different, as I said on Monday, from what we experienced in the 1970s and the 1980s. And to give it the term fascism, I think, is far too easy. There's far many people were doing that last night from the platform. It was a kind of hillock on an industrial estate in the outskirts of Cheadle, which is the outskirts of Stockport. And so for 400 to 500 people to be there, by the way, is worth a lot. And I think the future, part of the long-term future, which Steve asked quite rightly about what should we be doing, I think is about of getting our response in the long term as localized as possible, in communities, inside communities, as much as possible. And that, as I I've said before, is very much to do with providing a focal point for defense of community institutions such as mosques, immigration advice outfits, whether they're private or not. Of course, they all are now, and asylum seeker accommodation. We need to be providing that focal point, because people are already showing community spirit in all sorts of ways. The crowd of Muslims going through, I think it was Accrington or Blackburn, somewhere like that, after the riots, were embraced and applauded as they walked through the centre of a northern town by white people, local white people, who saw them as part of their community now. Whatever has happened in the history of these places, a lot of people have grown up and now embrace a multiracial Britain. And as I see it, there are two parties. There's the multiracial party, which is, broadly speaking, democratic, broadly speaking, stands for diversity, is anti-imperialist, and we have what I would prefer to call the imperialist party, or the imperial party, or the empire party, because as a speaker from the Black Panthers was saying last night in Cheadle, this derives itself from empire and the imperial mindset. And it's that imperial mindset which includes mostly English people, but also some Scottish people. I was part of the Scottish crowd who booed, I didn't boo, but booed and abused black English players about 15, 20 years ago at Hampden Park. I saw it, experienced it for myself. So, let's not paint Scots with this kind of picture of being completely different. Scottish values have evolved just like they have in England, and they have evolved more progressively since those days in England. But Scotland was very much part of the empire, as Ken says. So I agree with Ken on that. Where I disagree with him on is, as Mike pointed out, equating the two nationalisms. They are entirely different, entirely different. It has always been a subservient relationship. It was carried out by force of arms at the time of the Act of Union, and a demonstration of military power and financial power as well, which in the various bubbles that happened in the early 18th century, the Scots economy was ruined quite deliberately by the City of London. And there's been a history of suppression ever since. It's interesting that there's nothing like this in London, which is the most multiracial and diverse part of England and part of Britain. Also, there were minor scuffles in Birmingham, but again, very little. No racist demonstrations in places like Wolverhampton and the Black Country whatsoever. Very little in Birmingham. In Manchester, we had problems. In Manchester, where there was a crowd of fascists in Piccadilly Garden, well, racists and various assorted people. They do in the bigger cities, I think that where there is a tradition of fascism in Northern England and the Midlands, we do get perhaps a higher proportion of fascists in these crowds. I think there is some kind of regional factors at play here as well. But Cheadle was very good. I also wanted to criticize the Black Panthers because they were talking in very kind of almost racist terms about I'm not here to apologize for white racism, meaning they didn't want to have a discussion on the economic marginalization and the political abandonment of working class white people living in impoverished circumstances by the Labour Party over 30 or 40 years. Didn't want to enter into that. So what I started to say was there is a big difference between understanding and apologizing for, and we need to accept that. Because when the Panther woman stepped down, she got enormous condescending applause from the white audience. And I've seen that happen again and again and again. And while Black people have the right and the need to have a leadership of their own autonomous organizations within an anti-racist struggle, it is white people have a very important role as well to play in relation to the white community. And if we decide we're not going to bother to understand that white community because we're calling them fascists, or because we regard them all as tarred of the same brush, or like my old friend John Pearson, who said, I disagreed with some of the things you said last night, John. In particular, I don't think they were the working class. His reason. Because Trotsky said that the foot soldiers of fascism are the petty bourgeoisie. And beginning and end of thinking for a lot of Trotskyists in this country. He calls me an anarchist, by the way. But what I think we need to do is, like Steve said, look at the long term. And I think that starts with recognizing the differences that there are within that unity that we saw last night. We have it between some Muslims, and I tried to send this thing to everybody this morning and it failed. and it's from an organisation in Manchester, which I get hundreds of WhatsApp messages from, which is basically a Muslim-only Palestinian solidarity type organisation, which actually operates on a purely Ummah religious basis. Rather than on a business on the basis of solidarity in alliance with other people against Zionism. And that is something which a lot of Muslims have escaped from, because their experience within the mass movement to Palestine solidarity has meant that they have been exposed to and listened to socialists, white speakers who are pro their rights and their dignity and their right to no discrimination and to equal rights in this country, who are anti-imperialist and so on. But there still are people like that around. There's the Black Panthers, who are now organised, certainly in Manchester, and are speaking to a black audience, which is understandable and quite correct. But when they speak to a white audience, it comes across as totally dismissive. Don't bother thinking about these people. They are the enemy. Some of the things that were said last night in Cheadle were very interesting. One was 2 or 3 people said that this is the decisive battle over what is going to happen in this country, whether we are going to move towards what some people there were calling fascism. It could be a more authoritarian, totalitarian state. But they said we could move in that direction, or we could move in the opposite direction. And that is the battle that's happening at the moment. But we need to be cognizant of the potential divisions and contradictions within our ranks. Yes, Steve, it was broadly the same people who were there last night, in my experience. I think a lot of people came from Manchester to Cheadle. I know that
John, can I just ask you to round up? It's been really interesting, but I do have 2 other hands up.
Okay. Stand Up for Racism has come in for quite a bit of flack from Tony Greenstein tonight. I was with the Marple-based Stockport organizer for it, who does distribute Socialist Worker, but it doesn't appear to be an SWP front to me. It has grown to be more than that, but I would still be very, very. But I'm going to watch them from the inside anyway, because I've signed up to the Greater Manchester one. But yes, the future is really, really important. The speakers last night could be right that this is a decisive battle or series of battles, and we need to move forward in the longer term. And I think that our politics are in a place where we can do that, and provide some leadership on that. That is going to be really, really important, because like Steve said, not many people aren't thinking about that. In fact, they prefer not to think at all. They rely on what is written. They take a recipe from 40 or 50 or 100 years ago and just apply it without any kind of thought in between, as far as I'm concerned. But then I don't like Trotskyists very much. Okay, sorry.
Thanks very much, John. That was obviously a very interesting meeting that you were at last night. I had no idea that the Black Panthers were still alive and kicking, as it were. That's a really interesting point. I'm going to bring in Peter Grant and then Malcolm Millay.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, excuse me, Carol. Yeah, it's been very interesting what people have been saying. Just on a side, what John was talking about earlier, it was actually Accrington that incident took place. What happened was that the Asian Muslim people were walking between the two mosques in Accrington to desist any attack, which they were expecting an attack on the mosques. And as they walked down the high streets in Accrington, out of one of the pubs, which had a flag of St George in the window, looked like what we would have termed a fascist venue. They came out of that pub and were actually embracing the Muslim protectors of the mosque, and were hugging them and cheering them on. And if anyone knows anything about Accrington, that is an amazing thing to have happened, because it has been a divided town for a fair while. The British National Party got quite sizable votes in that area when they stood in a couple of elections ago, and that's something to give us heart and encouragement. The other thing I was going to talk about was this issue of fascism, because I think you're right that we need to define this properly. It's a lazy label that is applied to anyone that's anti-immigrant and anti-left, and there is a big difference between hooligans on the basis of like football hooligans, which a lot of these people were, and the organised, really badly, organised Nazi type fascists that are in the background, planning and making the decisions, because they do have an ideology, and it's important that we recognise that. But it's also important to recognise that fascism is a weapon that is used by the ruling class when they lose control and they can no longer rule in the old way, and they have to unleash the forces of fascism in order to smash the working class and its organisations, and smash the liberals and the everybody else that opposes them. And the thing with that is that, as it was in the 30s, it gets out of hand. As soon as you unleash those forces, properly unleash them, it gets out of hand, and you end up with a Hitler and the mass extermination of a minority of one sort or another. Because what we saw over the last few nights is the beginnings of a pogrom, and it had all the facets of a pogrom attack, which is not something that I've ever witnessed in my life. We've had battles with the right wing, the Nazi elements of society. We've had battles with them, but we've never had proper organised pogroms. And that, when you see Rotherham, the people organising that, encouraging people, especially the youngsters, to burn the place down. The intention was to actually set fire to that hotel with the people inside it and trap them in there. It could have, if it hadn't have been stopped, that could have resulted in a large loss of life. And that's one of the things they were trying to project onto it. And then, of course, you've got Farage and people, but Farage is one of these thinkers. He's not an idiot. He's one of these right-wing thinkers that believes that they should build a movement, not necessarily a fascist movement, but a right-wing Trumpist type movement, to win elections and to gain power. But as I say, I don't think you can call it. It's not all fascism in that sense, and I think we need to have a proper discussion about that and an educational, so that we start to understand exactly what we're looking at when we're looking at these forces. The other thing I just raised quickly is the amazing front pages of the press today. It was it's absolutely amazing that the right wing press, the Daily Mail, and all that lot, the Express, were saying hurrah for the anti-fascists. And we've had the Chief Constable of Merseyside has been on the box, praising the civic nature of the anti-fascist demonstration. The fact that they chased the right out of Liverpool, out of where they were planning to coalesce, and that's not been seen before. So again, we need to sort of look at these things and discuss what exactly is going on, because to see the Daily Express and the Mail on our side gets me a little bit worried. I get the heebie-jeebies on that. But yeah, that's all I've got to say on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pete. Yes, I agree with you. When the Daily Mail starts supporting the anti-fascists, yes, very strange indeed. I'm going to bring in Malcolm Millay and then Mark Metcalf.
All I wanted to say was that when I was listening to the part of the talk I got from John Tumman, yes, I couldn't help noticing his whole talk was laced with the terms of black and white and black and white and black and white. And I don't think this is at all helpful. I mean, as a grandfather of quite a lot of children who wouldn't fit in either of those boxes, I don't think it helps very much to put, apart from the fact that nobody is black and white anyway, and we're all the same colour. So I think the whole language about that should change. And I think people talking in terms of black and white constantly just feed into the whole misconception of people being different because the shade of their skin is slightly different to other people. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. I'm going to bring in Mark Metcalf now.
Okay, good evening, comrades. How can I start this? Well, in 1986, the British National Party and the National Front took 2,500 people to the cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday. 2.5 years later, as a result of vigorous opposition led by anti-fascist action, of which I was an active participant, they'd been reduced to less than 300 people taking part in that event. In September 1992, Screwdriver event, 1,500 tickets were taken for a gig where nobody knew it was. Anti-fascist action mobilized people. Only 400 people got to the gig. A number of buses, a number of other things were prevented from getting there. And that was done, of course, by vigorous action. We closed down nearly all of the train stations in South London at that particular period of time as the consequences of it. So much as I admire the 25,000 people who turned up over the last few nights, I don't for a single second believe that that movement, which currently exists under the front organisation of Stand Up to Racism and Unite Against Fascism, will ever be able to mobilise enough people to physically resist fascists as they come. And I'll use that term loosely at this particular point because I think some of the points made are very accurate. And however, I don't believe they have the capability, the personalities, or more importantly, the relationships of the people to their class, which is basically they're basically middle class people, and they are not going to stand up to fascism. Let's get this absolutely right. That was the biggest fascist demonstration that this country has ever seen in London a few weeks ago. 25 to 30,000 people turned up on their event. This is not unusual. 2018, I went across to join the anti-fascists in Leeds. There were 300. They were happy to be kettled. Robinson's lot, the EDL, 700 marched around the town, and they had taken the town. This is, like I said, that's Leeds, a city of nearly 1 million people. Only 300 anti-fascists were able to turn out to oppose. And these things have been happening now for a significant amount of time. There's no question about the fact that the far right is in the ascendancy. And to describe last night as a victory, as I've put in the talk, is to basically say we won 2-0, but we lost the first leg 7 or 8-0. Liverpool on Saturday, 1,000 fascists. Liverpool is the most militant city in England, and they couldn't mobilize 10, 20, 30 people to come out and oppose them. That's the reality. That is the reality that we are actually at this particular stage. We may as well be honest about that situation. So we don't have the organizations, even if they are front organizations. Now let's look at the trade union movement as it exists. The trade union movement has farmed out its anti-racism to pathetic groups. There's no other word about it. Show racism, the red card. Show racism, the red card were put to the test in 2013 when my own football club had a fascist as a football manager. And some of us, at great cost, it has to be said, including the death threats that we got from fellow supporters, said this was wrong and Show racism, the red card should cut ties from Sunderland Football Club. And they refused. They were set to go ahead with a poster, an anti-racist poster with the Canio in the middle of it. That was all covered by Searchlight in terms of the situation. Hope Not Hate, we don't really want to go into Hope Not Hate in terms of its relationship to Zionism, but it is exceptionally strong. They should stand up to racism. The current state of it is unwilling to take on the position of Zionists who attend their demonstrations. The very Zionists who are putting out Islamophobic stuff about people, about the demonstrations. Politically, let's have a look at the reasons why these things have grown, apart from the weaknesses of our own politics. If you were to read an article which I wrote, and it's still a very good article, I know articles which I write, they're not always good, was done in the big issue in the South, 2003, and it was simply called Racism, What Problem? And it was a breakdown of the fact that the trade union and labour movement in Sunderland had done nothing for years, absolutely nothing. And so when refugees were put into Sunderland, that was 1,000, only 1,000, the BNP's vote went from 0 to 37, 38%. And Payman Barney at the top of my street, literally 200 yards from where I live, he was stabbed to death. And we had a mobilization of around 400 people. And the trade union movement, I wrote to every single one of them as the Secretary of Sunderland Fans Against Racism. And they all told their members, virtually all of them, including some staff who were actually disciplined for attending, not to attend that demonstration and not to attend that event. The Durham Miners' Gala, probably the greatest social occasion of the working class in this country, had a black speaker, a black trade union speaker this year. There hasn't been one. You have to go back to the 1920s. So that's the situation that we're facing. There's no question that it is the most serious and sustained attack by the far right on our civil liberties. They may not call themselves fascists, but certainly the leadership have an understanding of fascism. Now, going on to Sunderland, the actual situation in the northeast, why is it thrived? It is thrived because of the decimation of decent jobs. Racism would still have thrived, but the reality is the defeats of 81 in terms of the shipbuilding industry and the defeats of 84-5 and the heroic struggle, which many of us joined on the picket lines during that particular period. I'd like to finish by talking about what's happening here in Halifax. There has been mobilisations, significant mobilisations in support of Palestine. It's been largely people from the South Asian community which have been mobilised. So on the demonstrations of 400 to 450, a good 300 will be from that community. A demonstration was due to be held on the 17th of August, and that event has been moved now to September. In my view, that's a wise move at this particular period of time. Halifax, only 15 years ago, had 4 BNP councillors, and I fear that I do agree that at this point, those such mobilisations, unless properly organised and defended, could come under attack. We now have a ridiculous situation in which Stand Up to Racism, who recently had a public meeting of which one of the 12 people who were present, 12 people came up from London, and another one was from the Trades Council, who went along and did a stall, of which I'm the secretary in terms of the situation, who've now called an event on Saturday on the very first day of the football season. And I've said that I believe this to be actually a ridiculous situation, as they don't have any stewards. They don't have any people who can defend it. The reality is they have spoken to the police, and they will definitely be hoping that the police at least are aware of any possibilities. So it's not surprising that the police are praising the anti-fascists, because the anti-fascists will undoubtedly, some of them, be working with the police. That is the relationship that has been developed, and that is the reality. Is the anti-fascists, as they currently exist on large mobilisations, if the fascists turn up, need the police. The anti-fascists in Rotherham, they got chased. They rightly ran away. Otherwise, they would be hospitalised or possibly even killed. I'm sorry to pour petrol on what people believe, but it needs actually saying. We're facing a very serious situation. We need a response which involves, without doubt, the building of squads of people and self-defense groups. Trade unions too are active and other things should be persuaded to get some training, certainly for events, for stewarding, picket lines and strike actions, because at some point they will be coming for the workers that are on struggle. I did put in the thing a booklet which I published, which sold 5,000 copies about 20 years ago. It's called The Anti-Nazi League, a critical examination 77 to 81, 82 and 92, 95. The ANL is the only serious organisation where the SWP were able to mobilise large numbers of people. The article, which is written by Jim Kelly, a taxi driver these days, who Steve will know very things on that period, 77 to 81, 82, is a brilliant piece of work which talks how Peter Davis and the rest of them in Lewisham worked and managed to smash the National Front of the things. And my own piece is a piece on 92, 95, when the ANL was set up purely and simply because at the time anti-fascist action was getting a lot of traction. They hoped to build on that traction and to actually recruit members. And Unite Against Fascism and Stand Up to Racism is an anti-democratic front. You would never be able to get onto the central committee of that, unless, of course, you would be a Labour MP or somebody else like that. They just would not be acceptable. That's it. Thank you for listening, and let's hope some of the things, my fears, prove to be completely and utterly inaccurate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, but quite depressing, because you've obviously got your ear to the ground and know what's going on. So it is something very serious from what you've just said. So thank you very much for your contribution. Okay, I'm going to bring in John and then Russell. John.
Hi all. Yeah, I mean, so much has been said. What Mark was talking about, that does really make you think, really, it's something like we need a workers' militia, perhaps, something along those lines. If it goes that way, so it's a frightening thought, but it's possible. So, a bit about what happened in Brighton. We knew there was probably some of them turning up, which they did, but then you had thousands of anti-racists turning up. So we had finished up partying last night as such, and the police let us alone. Tonight in Cocktail, they had a rally around the issue, and invited all the trade unions and speakers and so on. And tomorrow, a group of Brighton people have hired a bus and going down to Crawley, because it looks like they're going to have a go in Crawley tomorrow. As far as Englishness goes, it is complex, but I mean, I'm of Irish heritage. I was born here, so I do have sympathies, particularly because of what's happened in the past with Ireland and England, or Ireland and Britain. Sympathies, but I see it as a class issue. I mean, when the IRA was around, I never supported terrorism, but I always saw it as a class issue and still do. And so how we actually get it across, I mean, I'm glad to hear that we're looking at getting publicity locally from our perspective, that it is a class issue. I mean, even Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who known as his alter ego is Tommy Robertson. His mother's Irish, and apparently he did have a Muslim solicitor who he's just sacked, or she walked out because of what's happened. But he's actually got a Muslim solicitor because he's in a lot of financial trouble. He actually, the video he put out was a demonstration in London a few weeks back about the Syrian boy supposedly abusing white girls. He still owes £100,000 to that boy. So he's in all kinds of financial trouble. He's sitting out there sunning himself. He even had the gall to complain that his privacy had been affected. That his hotel had come out where he was staying. I mean, man's amazing. But a very frightening character. Farage, obviously stoking it, but very cleverly, and Musk stoking it, but very cleverly too. Issues around perhaps, I mean, we know that the Reform Party has got 4 million votes, and we also know that through opinion polls, the majority of them would be voting for something close to, deportations, so on and so on. In other words, stop the boats and so on. So I was wondering what the link may be to Brexit is in all this as well. I'm not sure as to exactly how many people came out in the which was to vote for Brexit in the main areas. And with how much writing there was there, and how much anti-nation was there. But I thought that maybe Brexit and the full party, put them two together. And as somebody said, Farage is looking to build a not a fascist party, but what you call I don't know what to call it actually. I mean, I find it difficult because, as we said, the word fascism has lots of different connotations and lots of different definitions, depending on the person who's actually saying it. We do have an actual definition, but which is, nationally or internationally agreed through, by Marxists and so on, Trotskyists and Leninists and so on. So, yeah, we have to work out, because I hear it a lot now. It's like I was at the trans thing last Saturday, where we had, it was a big turnout, but we had Pride here, Brighton Pride, and the actual demonstration had all these, what we had. You've got corporate pride, right, which is, the main pride, and then you've got what we have is alternative pride, which is, supporting trans and their allies. And what happened was that along the demonstration, people were, shouting at cops, "We hate cops, we hate cops." The anti-trans, also calling them fascists and so on and so on. But the good news is the bus that came along, because we were shouting no pride in genocide, such, and as I say, as the march came along, we stopped a bus, which was specifically Barclays, who was sponsored in Israel, and the police were okay. They accepted it, and they diverted the actual big demonstration, the real demonstration, somewhere else. And so there's the way you police something is very important. But yeah, I mean, I just want you to kind of bring those points up, really. Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks very much, John. I'm going to bring Russell in now.
Thanks, Carol. It's been a very interesting, extensive, wide-ranging discussion. But the thing that has struck me most from the discussion is there remains a lack of clarity as to what is a fascist and what is fascism. The closest we've got to defining fascism is Peter Grant's articulation that it is a social phenomenon that arises when the ruling class is unable to resolve the tensions and contradictions and imposes an authoritarian repressive system in the hope that that will resolve the contradictions. And that's very much a Marxist theory of fascism, derived from Marx's famous work, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. A more contemporary attempt to theorize fascism is Nikos Poulantzas's work. I think it's called Fascism and Dictatorship. So, but in a way, that is not the most problematic area. More problematic is defining fascism and fascist behavior among people who we hurl the abusive term fascist, you behaving like a fascist, they fascist thugs, etc., etc. And the most authoritative account of that is one written long ago by a Marxist psychoanalyst. People may have heard of the name of Wilhelm Reich, and he wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And I would suggest we turn ourselves to having a look at that. And then the two luminaries of the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, wrote a work on the authoritarian personality in an attempt. They were I think they were both Jewish, both German Jews who were scholars in the Frankfurt School and had to flee Germany, and they wrote this work trying to understand what is the fascist personality, what is the fascist character. Now, that might sound all academic and abstract, given the immediacy of the situation we are faced with now. But I sort of fall on the side of saying that this right-wing mayhem and violence is fascist. It does reflect a fascist type of psychology and character, and we've got to call it out for what it is. That doesn't mean to say that that all these people are self-conscious fascists, and of course it's a dynamic situation. And I'll just, without sort of going on too much, I just want to say that I plumb on the side of those who think that in order to understand fully what's going on and in order to address the problem, you have to fall back on a class analysis. You've got to fall back on the very difficult circumstances that working people are finding themselves in at the moment. Okay, I think I could go on a lot more, but to spare you, I will finish there. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Russell. Maria has put something really interesting in the chat from David Miller. Maria, would you like to come into the discussion and talk about what you've just put in the chat? Because I think I'm thinking I'm very much along the same lines as you are. So Maria, would you like to come in, Maria? I'm just going to read, if I may, what Maria's put up into the chat. She said from David Miller that the riots have been instigated by the Zionist asset Stephen Yaxley Lennon, Tommy Robinson, who has been working for the state of Israel since 2009 as part of the so-called counter-jihad Islamophobia movement established by that state. And when his organization, the English Defence League, was incorporated in 2011, 2 years after its inception, it was named the English and Jewish Defence League. A Zionist terrorist organization has been a key part of violent Islamophobic street thuggery in the UK over the past decade. Yaxley Lennon is one of the most high-profile actors in the State of Israel's online influences program in response to Operation Al-Aqsa Storm, Al-Aqsa storm, sorry. He and others like I can't read that one, it's so small. London, Noah Tishby, Hen Mazig, Arsen Ostrovsky, and Emily Schrader, and many others are paid to distribute Zionist propaganda, of which pushing back against and pro-Palestinian protests and sowing Islamophobia are two important and interlinked aims. Finally, there are also questions about which actor authored the idea that Muslims were responsible for the ostensible triggers for these events.
Hello, Roxy.
ISIS and its assets, e.g. Paul Mason, are desperately trying to pretend this was something. Russian disinformation was a Russian disinformation operation, but the original stories did not come from Russia. Where did they come from? I find that really very interesting, because it has occurred to me that all this action on the streets is really taking the spotlight off what's happening in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. So I just thought that was worth reading that out. I'm sorry if I couldn't read it quickly enough. It was very, very small. So Richard, I've got Richard Chilvers coming in now.
Bit concerned, to be honest. I think that, in fact, that on the whole situation, really, I think it's been brewing up for many, many years. Successive Tory governments have been actually instigated. They've actually been they've been actually bringing it about. I mean, they've been instigated. I mean, the whole thing with the stop the boats and everything, the way that it's being played. The government was expecting all this. I think they're actually fanning the flames of interracial conflict in the streets to justify it. But the other thing is, I think it is tied in with with Gaza and Palestine, and also with Brexit. So so that's one thing. But I'm a bit concerned about that. I think it could be that an attempt to destabilise the government. I mean, it's all hit off not long after the election of a Labour government. So it looks like rather coordinated, an attempt to destabilise. I mean, mustn't forget that, in fact, Farage said that after getting elected and 5 MPs in Parliament, we're now out for Labour. So I think it could be coordinated. It's tied in with Brexit, the failure of Brexit, or at least to push forward into a proper nationalist movement further down the road. So, and I think it will actually be reflected in the reorganisation of the Tory party in Parliament. But the key factor is, of course, is the policies, the economic and political policies of the Labour government, which the present Labour government, which are actually encouraging this to take place, to be honest. And I think it's incumbent on the suspension of the MPs for over the two-child cap, the relationship that I think this is maybe very well be a very something that will have to take place in the future over the whole orientation of Labour movement. I think it's actually a bit worrying that the criticism of the stand up to racism is actually exists, and I think we need to actually build it up rather than try and replace it. I think that's the other thing I would say too. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Richard. Russell is coming back in. Russell?
Yes, I have to say that as a Jew, I find David Miller's tweet completely over the top and, in fact, quite anti-Semitic. It has there's no evidence to link that. In fact, it was reported the other day that the orchestration of this fascist thuggery was already instructing the masses to target Jews, and there's been heightened security within Jewish institutions against this. So, you know, I would, you know, I consider David Miller's tweet as dangerous as I do these fascist thugs on the streets of the UK.
Right. Thanks very much, Russell. I'm going to go over to back to Steve now. I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going back to Steve now.
Okay, thank you, Colin. It's been a very interesting discussion, some very well worth points. I think Mark introduced a note of realism into it. But we'll go back to it. The question I think was being argued was whether we should call this fascist in some senses or not. And in what sense it was, which is what I did call it at the beginning. And I do draw, it's not the case that I just bandied the term fascist around hither and thither and just go, oh, well, I don't like these bad people, we'll call them fascists. That would be nonsense. Fascism is a particular phenomenon, as comrades have emphasized, and I do draw a distinction between what I call fascism and the Reform Party is what I call right-wing populism, anti-establishment populism, if you like. Now, there's a connection between fascism and that, but they're not the same thing. And I think where fascism, for me, the key thing about fascism, whether it's coming from above or below, is the destruction, I would say, it's the destruction of liberal democracy. And but that's because they want to destroy working class democracy. It is the democracy of the trade union movement that is the backbone, really, of liberal democracy. So they really want to do that in and abolish that, and they want to get rid of the socialists and so on. They want to implement a dictatorship without any rights. And in order to do that, in order to divide the working class, racism plays a very big role in that, whether it's anti-Jewish racism, anti-Semitic racism of the Hitler type, or whether it's some other form in modern society. I mean, it just occurs to me that Muslims are today in the role that Jews were in Germany. You know, they have that function for attempting to divide the working class. You know, that's it. And obviously, there's a difference between football hooligans and organised. It's about fascism is about their being. So I think Russell already answered that. Many people who gather around a fascist mob aren't necessarily fascists. But it's who's organising it, who's financing it, who's behind it. That's what you really have to know. And obviously, that's a matter of theory. It's both partly theory, but also what evidence is there? Now, David Miller may be completely barking up the wrong tree. He may or may not. I think there is some connection, by the way, but he may be barking up the wrong tree. I would be looking to America myself to see who's financing Tommy Robinson. And there's a lot of billionaires in America are doing that. But I think it's true that the British ruling class, the British Crown, have no need for fascism at this present moment in time. They don't feel particularly threatened. They don't see the need to abolish the trade union movement or do any of those things, which is the phenomenon that you see the Daily Mail cheering or relieved, if you like, that there's been a setback for the fascist movement. And it was a setback. I mean, not a defeat. Let's not say it was a defeat. It was a setback that people came out in a large. But Mark's right. You can't beat that organised violence by simply numbers. You have to have organised self-defence to be able to do that. So going back to Mark, I think, Mark, I'd want to say there is a big difference in what we're saying is there's a big difference between what happened in the 1980s and 90s, or even the 1970s and 80s and 90s, with the National Front and the British National Party, which I see as being defeated. They were defeated in that period. Fascism didn't grow in that period. But what we're arguing is that because of the crisis of democracy, because of the special epoch that we're now living in, there's a crisis of our political system. There's a crisis in the union between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's a danger of anarchy, lawlessness, need for a strong leader. There are conditions that make fascism likely to reappear. The bourgeoisie don't need it, so they won't be putting a lot of money into it right now. But it'll grow anyway, whether they put any money into it or not, because at some point they might need it. And at some point they'll say, right, okay, it's your turn. And they'll let it go. But they're not doing it right now. They don't need it right now. They've not lost control of the streets right now. They've not lost control of the trade union movement right now. So it'll grow because racism and other forms of organisation are there growing. You know, Mark was right, 6,000 people. When 6,000 people a couple of weeks ago demonstrated around Tommy Robinson, and they were flying flags of St. George. They weren't really flying the Union flag. It's the English Defence League is their motive, and that's what they're doing. 6,000 people. People said we've never seen a group of, they saw it as fascists like that recently, marching on the streets. And then the last time, now of course again there are differences. What are the actual numbers? We don't exaggerate them, but I have seen figures say 25 to 30,000. Maybe that's not right. I don't know, but it's certainly a pretty large number, I can tell you, of flags of St. George. Flag of St. George, English patriotism, English identity. That is what fascism will be, and it will be different from the fascism of the British of the 1970s and 80s, the British National Party, the National Front, the British National Front, and all the rest of it. And that's because of the evolution of our crisis, because of the evolution of Scottish, Welsh, and Irish nationalism, and the fact that people are looking for a different identity, and the fascists are going to use this one. That's what I'd say, and that's why they could have said we're organising as Britain First or alternative, patriotic alternative or something else. But the thing they're all organising around is an organisation that doesn't actually exist. It's just an idea, which is the English Defence League. And it's a bit like saying if Hamas would still exist, even if it killed all its leaders, because it's an idea that remains powerful, and it's certainly got some traction. So I'll go back to the original point. I think that Ken was making, that he hasn't recognised that British identity is in decline. English identity is emergent. That's what's happening. And what we have to do is to shape that and not let English identity be seen as white. You know what I mean? That's what they're doing with English identity. That's what we as Republicans have to do. We want to create a different identity for people in England, which is not based on whiteness, not based on Anglo-Saxon Protestantism or anything like that, but is based on democratic ideas, democratic perspectives, and the idea of citizenship, that every person living, settled in England is English. Russell is English, by the way. You might not think that. He can be Jewish, he can be South African as well, but his prime aim is here, he's English, like the rest of us. And that's what we must assert, that, because it's nothing to do with race or blood or anything of that type. It's purely to do with where you are settled. If somebody comes from Scotland to join a demonstration, they're from Scotland. If they're living here, if they're Scottish living in England, then they're part of the English society, English life, whatever. And we have to assert that. Otherwise, we just leave it to the fascists to define it in racial terms, and that has to be contested. I'll finish there. It's a debate we'll have to go on, no doubt. And hopefully, we'll go on.
Thanks very much, Steve. We've got Phil with his hand up. So, Phil, just going to bring Phil in.
Yeah, I think this idea of how we've got to this happening, and the idea of fascist ideology or racist ideology leaking in from the mainstream parties. There's a very good article by Ian Dunt today about how Farage has been the conduit that's bled this discourse of racism and authoritarian responses to the economic crisis into the mainstream, where he's ferried like a sort of over the river Styx. He's sort of ferried these ideas of Braverman and co into the smaller groups that he has influence with. So we have to note who the actors are in all this. Yaxi Lennon, yes, sure, but Farage is more important. And Farage is important because he also links into the states, as Steve pointed out. I believe that America is the crucial thing here. I have various thoughts about Russia, but my primary thought at the moment is America. It's because the Peter Thiel of the Heritage Foundation is close to Vance, who's close to Trump. They are pushing all this vile garbage out on their various networks and websites and so on. And so Farage ferries that stuff into the discourse as well. And one of the things that marks them out is that they always resign from their positions and turn themselves into victims. It was astonishing listening to Farage on LBC yesterday, where he claimed he was being victimized because people were accusing him of causing the riots. Well, he has a point. I mean, he didn't actually go out there and say, go and riot. But he has what is called plausible deniability. Those of us who are now commemorating and drinking to the Watergate scandal, which broke exactly 50 years ago today, will recognize plausible deniability. That's what Farage and that crew do. There's always money buzzing around. There's this woman who actually called Spothos, who she gave the name, she ferried the name of this fake name of this so-called Muslim name, which was allegedly the name of the suspect, that they all claim they attacked because of this being a Muslim name. Well, this woman is very wealthy. She's a multi-millionaire. She has a large farm up in Yorkshire, and her money has been got from various things. But one of the things she finances is the anti-vax paper, The Light. She's involved with anti-vax. She's involved with COVID denial. She's involved with anti-lockdown. She's involved with Brexit. She's involved with all sorts of things, but not in a democratic way. It's moving behind the scenes. She again is like Farage. She does all this. I didn't mean to say that. I'm sorry. I've been misunderstood. And when she posted this name, she actually said, the actual bald-faced cheek was that she actually said people must be careful about what they post online. And I thought that was almost like satire. We've reached that point. I wanted to ask people what they think about how there was a lot of praise for Starmer. He's done very well. He's rolled out his CPS, public prosecutions, direct public DPS, public prosecutions thing. And the police have been praised as well for doing very well. I'm concerned about this because in the 1970s, because the relations with the police were so appalling, we had SPG, the Special Patrol Group vans, had National Front stickers on them. It was much more overt, the pro-fascist sentiments of the police. But I don't like the idea that we have a movement, anti-fascist movement, which is basically relying on the police. We were autonomous and we hit the streets, I must say, with many more people, as Mark points out. But I'd also like to point out that the middle class was engaged in the anti-Nazi League. A lot of them were students, middle-class people. So it's not just a working class thing. I think that's a workerist opinion. And I would also point out the unions are much diminished today. It's no good looking to a membership that's almost gone down by a third in the last 50 years. You have to start thinking about how we organize beyond that. And also how the fascists have got a different model for organizing. They're using social media. They got money coming in from America. Peter Thiel, who's coming up with his 2025 project for Trump, he's funding a lot of these groups. And I think social media has changed the game. I think we've got to watch out. The Daily Mail is cheering along. Starmer, though, watch what he's saying. He's sent a letter to my friend who's a councillor in Kent. She received a letter 8:30 this morning in her email saying you're not to take part in any anti-fascist activity. You're not to post about these in favour of actions against the fascists. It's been very clear the Labour Party does not want to be seen to alienate what it perceives as these people who've maybe gone off the rails for a week or two, but they want to keep the red wall, as they call it, on their side. And they think somehow or other that's going to do it. Well, I remember the 1970, 78 when I was down in Lewisham and I nearly got thrown off a train by National Front people when they recognised that I was on the demo and they got on the train and they tried to throw me off. That particular demonstration, the Labour Party and the Communist Party demanded that people did not confront the National Front. And the National Front were 5,000 marching through Lewisham with 1,000 police protecting them. And the bricks flew and the front broke. They broke up. They were stopped. We don't stop the front by relying on the police. We don't stop the front by relying on the Daily Mail. We do not stop the front I'm using the front as a sort of, metaphor for fascists. But I think we need to mobilize people. And yes, some of them will run away because they're not practiced street fighters. But I think there is something to be said for just people being on the street. I mean, if you look at the media, those things on the media from Bristol, from various places, they look impressive. And I think, although the front think, oh, well, the fascists think, oh, we come and smash them up, they're just middle class. Well, they may think that, but it doesn't improve their standing. And that's where I stand with Steve on this. I think we're not in a fascist situation at the moment. They don't need the fascist movement, the British ruling class. They don't need one at the moment. So I think the answer then comes, what do we do? Well, we do what we've been arguing, which is democracy. We argue for democracy. That is the antidote to this. It's going to take time. It's going to mean organization. But don't forget that the people that the UK still wants to sell itself as a stable liberal democracy, even though we know from Starmer's behaviour since he came in that is very much on the line. I mean, when you get a government coming in, the first two things it does are to get rid of the 2-child cap or maintain it, and then cut pensioners by £300. Those people who go on those demonstrations, and Karen, again, my friend who's a councillor, told me that in Stoke-on-Trent, her father lives on an estate. Her parents divorced, and he lives on an estate in Stoke-on-Trent, where there was a lot of trouble with these people on the streets. And they are talking. They're saying, look, our grandparents have lost £300. You know, these are people who are hurting for various reasons, but they notice that a Labour government is not helping the children that they need to be helped by with benefits. And then they're cutting their grandparents or their parents of their pensions. So, of course, they're going to get fed up. And that's the danger of a Labour government, because if it comes in and does what it did in the 70s, which was extremely right wing, they allowed the SPG to do what they wanted. They after the IMF demanded that Healy went backwards and he came back from the airport and the cuts started. The whole of this thing, this whole neoliberal backlash, if you like, began a long time ago and people forget. But I don't think we're at that point yet. But I do think we're where the government is going to be, where the British ruling class is going to be funding a fascist party. But I do think that we have to get to grip with how we characterise the Labour government and what we want to make, what demands we want to make on them. And that we're not going to allow them to roll us over and visit another bunch of cuts on us and do austerity 2.0, because that is the root of this. The root of this is poverty. It's no prospects. Where do the children of these estates where Karen's father lived, where do they go and get a job that's going to last them a lifetime, be a career? There isn't one. Where do they go and get help if they have a disabled relative? What's happened to the Sure Start centres? What's happened to the youth centres? You know, you listen to these young people talking, who are anti-fascist, talking on the street. They're all saying, well, you know, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to go. You reach 16, there's nowhere to go. So I believe in absolute terms that it's not enough to just have people on the street. And I do see Mark's point, but there's political work to do. And that means digging deep. It means saying the Labour government is inadequate. Listen to Yvette Cooper. They rang up they got all their MPs on a Zoom call this morning and told them if they went down to any anti-fascist activity, they would face sanction. That's what they're doing. They are useless. And okay, I think Braverman would probably have been worse than Cooper as a Home Secretary in the current situation. But I'm very nervous of people who think because there's been a few demonstrations and the Daily Mail said well done and the police are smiling a bit and that sort of thing, and we've been clapped on the back by Sir Mark Rowley, that we should feel that we're in a strong position, because I do not believe we are. So I would say that agree with Steve, the British identity is in decline. I think they've hit on this idea that England is where it's at. And we have to organise and we have to make it clear that what has caused this crisis didn't just happen last week with Rachel Reeves, but Labour and Tories have been up to this for the last 40 years. Neoliberalism didn't begin on July the 4th. Thank you.
Absolutely not, Phil. My goodness. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's where the long-term issues come in. I mean, as you so rightly said, Labour's come in, the first thing they've done is not get rid of the 2-child benefit cap, and now they've taken away the winter fuel allowance. I mean, this is horrendous policy for a Labour government, not acceptable at all, and not helping the situation at all. So thank you very much indeed, Phil. I thought your last points were very pertinent indeed. I don't see any more hands up, and we've actually run over by about 20 minutes on our usual 90 minutes, but it's been an amazing discussion. Thank you very much to everyone who's contributed, who's attended the meeting. It has been a very, very interesting and important evening. So all I want to say now is goodbye and enjoy the rest of your evening.